the hunter finds a dog chained to a tree. As he approaches, he cannot contain his tears and begins to cry inconsolably. Carlos loved his walks through the forest. He always felt peace when he heard the birds and smelled the trees. But that day, something different happened. While walking down a little-known path, he heard a soft sound, as if it were a cry. He stopped, looked around, and followed the sound carefully. He found a scene that left him breathless. A skinny dog, with dirty and tattered fur, was tied to a tree with a tight leash. She seemed so tired and weak that she could barely move. Next to her, 5 very small puppies crouched close to her, seeking protection and warmth. Their eyes were sad, as if they were asking for help. Carlos, who had seen many things on his walks, had never witnessed something like this. His heart tightened when he saw those animals suffering. He knew he couldn't just turn around and leave. Something inside him told him he had to help. Slowly, he crouched down so as not to scare the dog and began to think about how he could save that little family. When Carlos got closer to the dog, he realized how much she was suffering. The strap around her neck was so tight that it had hurt her skin, leaving ugly scars that surely caused her immense pain. The poor dog was so weak that she could barely lift her head to look at him. She seemed exhausted, as if she had been fighting for a long time without strength. The puppies were in no better condition. They were so small and thin, trembling from cold and hunger. They tried to hide under their mother's belly, seeking warmth and security. But the mother, so tired and wounded, could barely take care of them. It was a sad scene to watch. Carlos felt tremendous sadness when he saw that situation. He knew the animals had been living for days, maybe weeks, without enough food or water. It was as if everyone around them was at peace, but they were trapped in that suffering. He knew he had to do something quickly because they wouldn't last much longer. Carlos knew he had to be very careful to help the dog. He didn't want to scare her anymore, as she was already very scared and weak. Then, he approached very slowly, speaking in a low voice, as if trying to reassure her. He had something to eat in his backpack, dry meat that he always carried on his walks. He took out a piece and offered it to the dog, trying to gain her trust. At first, the dog hesitated. She looked at Carlos with distrust, as if she didn't know whether he was a threat or if he was really there to help. But after a few seconds, the smell of food caught her attention. She sniffed the air and, with great difficulty, stretched her neck to take the piece that Carlos was offering her. Carefully, she took the food and ate it quickly, as if she hadn't eaten in a long time. Little by little, her confidence began to grow. Carlos continued to talk to her calmly, getting closer and closer, until he was finally close enough to help. He took out his knife and, with great care, cut the strap that was tight around her neck. The dog, now free, let out a deep sigh, as if she could finally breathe without pain. Carlos smiled, knowing that the first step to save that family was done. Before continuing, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you love animals and their moving stories. Once Carlos managed to free the dog, he felt that he needed to act quickly. Every second seemed to matter. Although she was still weak, the dog was finally free from the leash that hurt her. She collapsed on the ground, exhausted, as if she could finally rest. But Carlos knew that this was not the end of her problems. Approaching gently, he saw the wounds on her neck. The marks from the leash were deep, and some were infected, causing a pain that she seemed to endure in silence. Carlos took out his bottle of water and an old cloth that he had in his backpack. Carefully, he moistened the cloth and began to clean the wounds. With every touch, he tried to be as gentle as possible, fearing to hurt her more. The dog barely moved, as if she understood that he was there to help her. What broke Carlos's heart was the way she looked at him, with eyes full of pain and tiredness, but also with growing confidence, as if she knew that this unknown man was her only chance to survive. While cleaning the wounds, he spoke in a low voice, with simple and calm words, as if trying to console her with his voice. "Is everything okay now? I'm here to help you." After taking care of the mother, Carlos returned his attention to the puppies. They were so small, they barely had the strength to move. one of them was trembling so much that Carlos immediately took off his jacket and used it to cover them, trying to give them some warmth. He improvised a refuge using the backpack as a small nest to protect them from the cold. Seeing them so vulnerable, something inside him broke. Those puppies would never have an opportunity to survive without help. Carlos drank a little water and offered it to the puppies on the lid of a bottle. Little by little, with slow and fragile movements, the little ones began to drink, fighting to stay alive. The dog, although exhausted, watched everything closely, as if thanking each gesture of Carlos. In that moment, Carlos paused for a moment and looked into the dog's eyes. There was something deep in that look, something he could not explain with words. It was as if, for a brief second, he could feel all the pain she was carrying. The suffering she had faced was not only physical, it was the result of cruelty that Carlos could not understand. That animal, so fragile and defenseless, had been treated with malice that made no sense to him. How could someone do this? He whispered to himself, his voice drowned by the impact and sadness. Carlos had always been a strong man. His life as a hunter had hardened him in the face of nature's difficulties. He was not the type who was easily moved and rarely shed a tear, even in the most difficult situations. But at that moment, seeing that dog suffer and her undefended puppies, something within him broke. Without realizing it, the tears began to roll silently down his face. They were not tears of weakness but of deep empathy, of a connection with the pain that the mother was feeling. He could not help it. No matter how hard he tried to be strong, the weight of that scene was overwhelming. He quickly dried his eyes, as if he wanted to hide even the emotion he was feeling, but he could not deny the sadness that invaded him. The cruelty that the animal had faced seemed so unfair, so cruel, and Carlos felt a knot in his chest. In that instant, he knew he would do whatever it took to change the fate of that family. After giving the first care to the dog and her puppies, Carlos was getting ready to take them away from there. He had wrapped the puppies carefully in his jacket, creating a small improvised bed so that they did not feel colder. It was then that, while tidying up the floor around the tree, something shiny caught his eye between the dry and dirty leaves. The light reflecting off the object immediately caught his attention. He slowly crouched, moving the leaves and branches with his hands to discover what it was. At first, it looked like just a piece of metal lying on the ground, maybe a can or something similar. But when he cleaned off the dirt a little, Carlos realized that there was something special about that object. The shape was different, and the metal, though worn, showed intricate engravings on its surface. It was a shield of arms, the symbol carved into the strange era, with details that Carlos did not immediately recognize. But there was something that made it seem important, perhaps even ancient. He lifted the shield, cleaning it better with the fabric of his shirt, and examined it carefully. The weight of the object, the delicate work on the engravings, this was not just a piece of metal thrown by accident. As he passed his fingers over the shield, he felt a strange sensation, as if that find could have some connection with the history of the dog. What is this doing here, he thought, trying to understand. No matter how much his mind was focused on rescuing the animals, Carlos could not help but think that the shield could be an important clue. Who would have abandoned the dog there? And why? Perhaps the owner of the object knew something about it. Carlos, who had always been practical and direct, now found himself wrapped in unexpected curiosity. Something about that piece intrigued him deeply. He kept the shield in the pocket of his pants, determined to investigate later what it meant. There was still a lot to do. The priority was to take the dog and her puppies to a safe place. But the mystery of the shield remained resonating in his mind. The weight of that small metal object seemed to be more than just material. It was as if he were carrying a story with him. Perhaps the key to understanding why those animals had been abandoned, alone and suffering. While preparing to leave, Carlos looked at the dog one more time, which now, although weak, seemed to have a little more tranquility in her eyes. He knew he had done the right thing by helping her, but he also knew that there was something more behind that situation, something that he could not decipher yet. That shield would be an important piece of a larger puzzle, and Carlos was determined to discover all the answers, no matter how long it took him. After taking care of the dog and her puppies as best he could in the forest, Carlos knew it was time to take them to a safer place. He got up and approached the car, calling the dog with the same calm as before, waiting for her to follow him. But, to his surprise, the dog stopped. She looked at the vehicle with distrust, her ears dropped, and her body tense, as if something was holding her back. She didn't move forward, despite the fact that she seemed to trust Carlos. Every time he called her, the dog took a step back. Her eyes, once full of pain, now reflected pure fear. Carlos realized that she was not only scared by the current situation, that behavior came from something deeper. Perhaps her past, which he did not know, was full of traumas that she could not overcome. The way she looked at the car suggested that she associated vehicles with something terrible, perhaps the moment when she was abandoned or even mistreated. Carlos knelt on the floor, trying not to appear threatening. He extended his hand with a piece of food, as he had done before, and spoke softly. "Chica, ahora estás a salvo. No te herdano," he said with a soft and patient voice. He knew it was a struggle against her memories, not against him. It was as if the trauma of what she had lived through was preventing her from trusting completely in any human being, even someone who was clearly there to help her. The dog hesitated. She sniffed the air, still undecided. The fear was still strong, but there was something in the tone of Carlos's voice that seemed to calm her. She started to take small steps toward him, although her body was still tense. Carlos knew he couldn't rush her. Forcing the situation would only scare her more, so he stayed there, on his knees, waiting patiently. He offered another piece of food, and after a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, the dog approached and took the food from his hand. With a soft expression, Carlos slowly led her to the car. When they arrived near the open door, he noticed that she was still hesitant, with her tail down and her eyes wide open. But now, after having gained a little more of her trust, he carefully took one of the puppies and placed it inside the car. The dog watched the puppy, and although filled with fear, it seemed to understand that it should be by her side. Still nervous, she finally got into the car, keeping her eyes on the puppies, as if she wanted to make sure they were safe. Carlos closed the door slowly, relieved to have done it. The fear of the dog was still there, strong, like a shadow of the past that could not be erased. But now, at least, he knew he was starting to break the barrier that the trauma had created. After a silent trip to the city, Carlos took her to the closest veterinary clinic. The dog and her puppies were tired, but he knew they still needed urgent attention. As soon as he entered the clinic, he was received by an experienced veterinarian, who quickly realized the seriousness of the situation. The dog was carefully taken to an examination table, and Carlos stayed by her side, observing every movement with anxiety. The veterinarian began examining the dog, checking the wounds on her neck, the signs of malnutrition, and her overall health. He looked at Carlos with a serious expression. "She has been through a lot," the veterinarian said. "The wounds on her neck are deep, but we will take care of them. She is very weak, but with the proper treatment, she has a good chance of recovering." Carlos felt relieved when he heard those words. He knew that the recovery would be long, but at least now there was hope. While the veterinarian applied the first medications to disinfect the wounds and alleviate the dog's pain, Carlos observed the puppies, who were still restless and agitated. However, the smallest of them caught the veterinarian's attention. When examining one of the puppies more carefully, he frowned. "This one here has a deformity in the skull," lifting the little animal to show it to Carlos. "It is probably the result of some aggression suffered by the mother while she was pregnant. She may have difficulties developing." Carlos felt a knot in his chest when he heard that. The little one was smaller and frilier than the others, and now he knew that her survival would be even more difficult. But instead of becoming discouraged, Carlos was determined. He looked at the little animal in the veterinarian's arms and knew that he would do everything he could to give them all the opportunity for a better life, including that special puppy. The veterinarian continued with the exams, administering the first aid, cleaning the puppies, and applying medicines to ensure that everyone had a chance to recover. "They will need a lot of care and time to recover completely," Carlos said. But with patience, they will improve. While the veterinarian was finishing taking care of the animals, Carlos remained silent, reflecting on everything that had happened since the moment he found that little family in the forest. After making sure that the dog and her puppies received the necessary care in the veterinary clinic, Carlos could not get out of his head the injustice that these animals had suffered. The dog's painful gaze and the fragile state of the puppies continued to haunt him. He knew that he could not simply accept what had happened and continue with his life as if nothing had occurred. He needed to understand who had been so cruel as to abandon them in that situation. Then he remembered the shield he had found near the tree where the dog was tied. He took the object out of his pocket and studied it again, feeling that it could be an important clue. The symbol on the metal was still a mystery, but Carlos was determined to discover what it meant. He began investigating, asking the local neighbors. He went door to door, describing what he had found and showing the shield. Some people looked at him curiously, others indifferently. But one thing was certain, nobody seemed to immediately know who could be responsible. However, Carlos did not give up. He knew that, in small towns, news and rumors spread quickly, and someone would know something. After days of investigation and talking to the inhabitants, he finally found a clue. An older man, known for knowing the old stories of the region. "That shield belongs to an old family here," he said, pointing to the object. "They have a large farm nearby. Rumor has it that they are going through difficulties." Carlos felt his heart racing. The pieces began to fit. The mentioned farm was in a remote region, and if they were facing financial problems, that could explain the abandonment of the animals, although it would not justify the cruelty. Carlos decided he would go there. He needed to confront the responsible party and find out the truth behind that abandonment. He got into his truck and drove to the farm. As he approached, the scenery began to change. The land was neglected. The broken fences and the main house seemed aged by time and abandonment. Carlos parked the car and got out, feeling a mixture of nervousness and rage. If someone on that farm had caused so much suffering to those animals, he wanted answers. He walked to the entrance of the property, where he was greeted by a young man with a tired and distressed look. Carlos did not waste time and showed him the shield, asking directly if he knew anything about the abandonment of the dogs. The man hesitated for a moment, looking away, but Carlos knew that there was something behind that silence. "I just want to understand what happened," Carlos said, trying to remain calm, though anger was beginning to rise. "Those animals were left to die. You can't ignore that." The man sighed deeply, as if the weight of his actions was crushing him. "We couldn't take care of everything anymore," he admitted in a low voice. "Things got difficult here, and the dogs, we didn't know what to do." What that man faced, he didn't know, was that Carlos was also facing his own financial difficulties, perhaps worse than he imagined. In fact, at that precise moment, Carlos was going through one of the most complicated stages of his life. His brother had a serious health condition, and the medicines he needed were extremely expensive. So expensive that, many times, Carlos was at a crossroads. He had to choose between buying food or paying for the medicines. No air of a seal. The weight of that responsibility crushed him every day. Because of this, Carlos had started hunting every day. Any meat that he could get in the forest was a small relief because that meant the money he would spend on food could be used for other needs. Although exhausted, he continued firmly, forcing himself to believe that he would overcome the situation. But inside him, he struggled with thoughts that he did not even dare to say out loud. Before finding that dog tied up in the forest, a terrible idea had already begun to circle his mind, something that filled him with guilt every time it arose. "And if I donate my dogs, or even sell them," he thought in silence, his heart oppressed. Carlos had his own dogs, and they were his family. Just thinking about the possibility of getting rid of them sent a cold shiver through his body. No, he couldn't bear the idea. The mere thought made him feel disgusted with himself. As a human being, he despised himself for even considering such a possibility. "No," he said to himself firmly, as if trying to expel that dark idea from his mind. "We will overcome this together." And it was at that moment, just after reaffirming his determination, that he found that dog abandoned in the forest. Now, standing in front of that man, listening to his story, Carlos felt something deep. He was face to face with someone who had gone through a situation similar to his, someone who faced the same difficulties and, however, had made a decision that Carlos never had the courage to take. When he looked into the eyes of that man, who now had a heavy look of regret and guilt, Carlos felt a kind of relief. He realized that his choice to keep his dogs, even in the face of difficulties, was one of the best decisions he had made. The pain of regret and guilt that man would carry for the rest of his life was too heavy a burden to bear. Carlos understood, at that moment, that the price of getting rid of his animals would be much higher than he imagined, and it was not a financial price. It was the weight on the soul, the kind of burden that, once assumed, never lets go. Carlos remained silent for a moment, processing everything that had just happened in his mind. He looked at the man in front of him, seeing not only someone who had made an impulsive decision but a person broken by the weight of that choice. Regret was stamped in his eyes, and Carlos knew that feeling would not disappear soon. The man had let himself be carried away by despair, doing something that, in normal circumstances, he would never have done. Carlos breathed deeply, remembering all the times he had thought about making the same decision. He knew, viscerally, what poverty and difficulties could do to a person's mind. He knew what it was like to fight for survival, what it was like to be consumed by the fear of not having enough. And how, in those moments, dark ideas could arise, tempting. But now, seeing the state of that man, Carlos felt a silent confirmation in his heart. He had made the right decision. His own dogs, those faithful companions, had always been by his side, even in the most difficult days. They asked for nothing more than love and care, and in some way, that was what gave Carlos the strength to move forward. They were part of his family, and getting rid of them would have been like betraying something sacred. When he saw that man, Carlos understood that he would never have been able to carry the weight of such a painful decision. He looked directly into the eyes of the man and, for a brief moment, felt empathy. It was not only anger that filled his heart now, but a deep understanding. He knew how much difficulties could make a person feel desperate, pushing them to make decisions that, in another context, would be unthinkable. "I understand," Carlos said, with a softer voice than expected. "I know you were in a difficult moment. I also thought of doing something similar, but I realized that I could not live with that decision. I know that now you will have to carry that weight, and it is very heavy." The man looked at Carlos with eyes full of regret, unable to say anything. The pain of the error was already consuming him little by little. Carlos sighed, feeling that the tension in his shoulders was relaxing a little. He was not there to judge, but he could not ignore what had happened. He knew that justice for those dogs was not only about saving their lives, but also about ensuring that something like that would not happen again. "I hope you learn from this," Carlos continued, now with a firm tone. "Because this kind of pain does not disappear, and you will have to live with it." The man said nothing. Carlos knew that there was not much more to say. The regret of that man was evident, and the lesson had already been learned in the most difficult way possible. Carlos felt a mixture of emotions. He had faced his own shadows throughout this journey, and now he understood the true value of the decisions he had made. The dogs he almost considered abandoning were waiting at home, just like the dog and her puppies he had rescued. They weren't just animals, they were his companions, his family. And he knew, more than ever, that he could never betray them. As he started the car, Carlos looked at the ranch in ruins for the last time. He didn't know what lay ahead. But he knew he had left something important behind in that place, the decision to never allow difficulties to lead him to betray those who truly cared. He, his dogs, and the new furry family that was now part of his life would face the future together, with their heads held high. And that was, without a doubt, the best decision he had made. Thank you very much for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to leave your like. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your opinion about this story.